The letter was only 4 paragraphs long. I know, because I counted. 4 paragraphs, printed on cream-colored legal stationery with an embossed letterhead in the top left corner. Attorney Harold Vance, Estate and Family Law, Atlanta, Georgia. I stood at my kitchen counter on a Tuesday morning in October, still wearing my garden apron, soil under 2 fingernails, coffee going cold beside me. I had been repotting a fern when the mail came. I almost didn't open it. The return address had a law office name I didn't recognize, and for a half second I thought it was junk, one of those fake legal notices designed to look important so you'd open them. I opened it. I read the first paragraph standing up. I read the second paragraph more slowly. By the third paragraph, I had to put it down on the counter and take a breath. Not because I was hurt, not because I was angry, but because something was happening in my chest that I hadn't expected. A warmth, a kind of fizzing lightness that started somewhere near my sternum and moved upward. By the time I reached the fourth paragraph, I was laughing. Genuinely laughing, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere deep and surprised, the kind you can't perform. I laughed so hard that Daniel came out of the home office, looked at me with his coffee mug frozen halfway to his mouth, and said, "What is happening right now?" I slid the letter across the counter without a word. He read it, looked up at me, read it again. Then he started laughing too. My name is Martha Collins. I'm 34 years old. I own a small floral and event design studio called Bloom and Steady, 3 blocks from the home Daniel and I own outright in suburban Atlanta. I grow things for a living, literally. I arrange them, tend them, coax color out of reluctant stems. There's a kind of patience in that work that I didn't have 10 years ago. I learned it slowly, the way you learn most important things, through loss. 3 years before that letter arrived, I had gone completely no contact with my parents. No calls, no texts, no holiday visits, no birthday cards forwarded through relatives. Nothing. I had drawn a line so clean and so final that the people who heard about it, and many did because my mother made sure of it, assumed something catastrophic had happened. A crime, an addiction, something dramatic and visible. What actually happened was quieter than that, slower, more personal, and in some ways, far more devastating. The letter sitting on my counter that October morning was my mother's formal request, through legal counsel no less, for my signature on a document that would release funds from a financial arrangement, an arrangement that, I now discovered, required my name on the original paperwork years ago, a fact nobody had ever mentioned to me, a fact that meant, without my cooperation, nothing could move forward. My mother! The woman who told every Collins cousin, every church friend, every neighbor within a 20-mile radius that her eldest daughter was emotionally unstable, the woman who skipped my wedding, the woman who called my husband a lowlife to his face at a family dinner and then looked around the table like she expected applause. She needed me. She had always needed me. She just hadn't known it yet. Before we dive into how I set myself free, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you're truly enjoying this story. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. Now let me take you back to where it all began. I want to tell you something true about my mother before I tell you everything else. She was extraordinary once, or she seemed that way to me. I think that's the thing nobody talks about when they tell stories like this. The person who eventually hurts you most was also, at some point, the person who made you feel most seen. That's not a contradiction. It's actually the mechanism. You can't be devastated by someone you never loved. You can't mourn the loss of something that was never real to you. The wound only goes that deep because the roots went that deep first. Gloria Collins was the kind of woman who filled a room without trying. Not loud, never loud, more like a gravitational pull. She had this quality of paying attention to you that felt, when you were young and hungry for it, like sunlight on your face. She remembered details. She asked follow-up questions. She showed up to things. When I was 8 years old and played a shepherd in the church Christmas pageant, not even a speaking role, just standing there in a tea towel headdress holding a plastic staff, she brought flowers, an actual bouquet, for a child with no lines. I remember that so clearly. The weight of the flowers in my arms after the show, the smell of them, slightly cold from being carried in from the December air outside. She held my face in both hands and said, "You were the best one up there." I knew I hadn't been. I knew even then. But the way she said it made me not care about the truth. That was her gift, and eventually her weapon. We lived in a 4-bedroom colonial outside Marietta, my parents and me and my younger sister Tisha, who arrived 3 years after I did and immediately became the family's center of gravity. I don't say that with bitterness now, though I certainly said it with bitterness later. Tisha was magnetic the way some children just are. Big laugh, easy tears, the kind of face that made adults want to fix things for her. She wasn't performing it. That's what made it so effective. She genuinely felt everything loudly, and the family organized itself around the volume. I was the quiet one, the capable one, the one Keachers described as mature for her age, in a tone that meant they didn't have to worry about me, which also meant they didn't have to pay attention to me. I made my own lunch from age 9. I managed my own schedule from age 11. I learned early that self-sufficiency was how I earned space in a household calibrated around Tisha's needs, and I told myself that was fine. I told myself I preferred it. My mother and I had our own language for years, though. Sunday mornings, before the rest of the house woke up, she would come into the kitchen while I was already up. I've always been an early riser. And she'd make us both tea, and we'd sit at the breakfast bar and just talk. About nothing important, about everything that mattered. She talked about her own childhood, a harder one than ours, growing up with Les in South Carolina. She talked about what she'd wanted to be before she became a wife and then a mother. She talked about books she'd read and places she wanted to see. I held those conversations like something precious. I built myself partly out of them. The idea that my mother saw something in me worth a quiet Sunday morning. That felt, for a long time, like enough. Raymond Collins, my father, was a gentler presence and a less complicated one, though not in a way that served anyone well. He was an operations manager for a logistics company, organized and procedural at work, utterly without spine at home. Not cruel, I want to be fair. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had decided somewhere along the way that the path of least resistance ran directly through agreement with my mother, and he had been walking that path so long he'd forgotten there were others. When there was conflict, he looked at the floor. When there was a decision to be made, he waited to hear what Gloria thought. When, years later, I would need him to stand up, to simply bear witness, he would look at the floor then too. I loved him in the helpless way you love someone who is also, somehow, a disappointment. Tisha and I were never enemies. I want to be clear about that. We were sisters in the real, complicated sense, close in some years, distant in others, capable of the specific intimacy that only comes from shared childhood, and capable also of the specific cruelty that comes from the same place. We fought. We also stayed on the phone for 3 hours the night her first serious boyfriend broke up with her. We were real. Or I thought we were. The Sunday mornings with my mother continued through high school, through my leaving for college in Athens, through my coming home summers and holidays. They were the thread I kept returning to. Even when I began to notice in my early 20s that the conversations had shifted somehow, that my mother asked fewer questions and offered more opinions, I dismissed it. People evolve, relationships shift. I was growing up, she was adjusting. I had a talent for explaining things away. It's something I've since had to unlearn. The first time I brought Daniel home, I was 27. We had been together for 8 months at that point, long enough for me to know, with the particular certainty that doesn't require logic, that he was it. Daniel was a mechanical engineer who had grown up in a working-class family in Savannah, the first in his family to finish a 4-year degree. Quiet in the way that comes from confidence rather than timidity. He was also, by the time I brought him home, the most consistently kind person I had ever known. not performatively kind, structurally kind. It was load-bearing in him, part of how he moved through the world. My mother smiled at dinner that first night. She asked him questions. She always asked questions. It was her signature. But I noticed, in the way you notice a slightly off note in a familiar song, that the questions she asked Daniel had a particular flavor. What does your father do? And your mother? Where did you say you grew up? And your degree? Just the one? Each question was phrased politely, even warmly. Each one was, underneath, a measurement, a calculation being run in real time. After dinner, when Daniel was in the living room with my father, she stood next to me at the kitchen sink and said, very casually, "He seems nice, Martha. Just make sure he's going somewhere." I remember the exact sensation of that sentence, not pain, just a small, cold click, like a lock engaging. "He's an engineer, Mom." "I know, I just mean, make sure he has ambition. You work so hard, you deserve someone who matches that." She handed me a dish to dry. I dried it. We moved on. And that was how it worked for nearly 2 years. Small moments, small reframings, nothing I could hold up as evidence. Daniel was referenced with a particular careful neutrality, not warmly, never quite warmly, but never with open hostility either. Tisha, who had married Marcus Brown the year before at a wedding my parents funded generously and celebrated loudly, seemed to have a faint competitive instinct awakened by my relationship with Daniel. Subtle things, a comment here, a comparison there. "Marcus just got promoted. He's really making moves." I heard what was underneath. I chose not to respond to it. My mother started calling me more frequently around the time Daniel and I moved in together, not to talk the way we used to. The calls were different, shorter, more purposeful, carrying information in a way that felt like strategy. Who in the family had seen Daniel at some event, what someone had said. Observations, always framed with concern. "I just want you to be happy, Martha. I just worry." The word worry was used so often it started to feel like a fist wrapped in a glove. I started noticing what didn't happen. My mother never asked how the business was going unless I brought it up. She never asked about Daniel's projects, his work, the things that animated him. When I mentioned something he'd done, repaired something in the house, surprised me with something small and thoughtful, she would respond with a comment about Marcus. The comparison was never explicit enough to name. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. I mentioned it to Daniel once, carefully, and he looked at me with that level, unruffled gaze of his and said, "I know, I see it, but it's your family, and I trust you." That trust, Lord, that trust. When Daniel proposed, a quiet evening, no performance, just the two of us, and a question asked like it was the most natural thing he'd ever said, I called my mother before I called anyone else. I wanted her to be first. Some part of me still believed in the Sunday mornings, still believed that the right moment could restore us to something. She said, "Oh." Then she said, "Well, you've made your decision." Not congratulations. "You've made your decision," like I had chosen a paint color she disapproved of. I stayed on the call another 20 minutes, filling the silence with my own voice, explaining, elaborating, as if I could talk her into enthusiasm. She offered nothing. My father came on briefly and said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart," in a way that told me he was standing exactly where he always stood, 2 steps behind Gloria, waiting to be told what the right feeling was. I got off the phone and sat with it for a long time. I told myself it was surprise. I told myself she'd come around. I told myself that mothers were complicated and love was complicated, and this was just a rough patch in a long relationship and she would come around. She did not come around. The dinner was my idea. That's the part I've had to make peace with. 3 weeks before the wedding, I suggested a family dinner. My parents, Tisha and Marcus, Daniel and me at my parents' house. A gesture of connection, an attempt to smooth the edges before the ceremony. Daniel didn't love the idea, but he came because that's who he is. He put on a nice shirt and drove 40 minutes and shook my father's hand at the door and meant every second of it. The first hour was survivable, surface-level conversation, the kind families manage when they've agreed, without saying so, to stay in shallow water. My father asked Daniel about a football game. Tisha talked about a vacation she and Marcus were planning. My mother moved in and out of the kitchen with the focused energy she brought to hosting, which had always been a form of control. The person who controls the meal controls the room. It was during dinner, we were passing dishes, the kind of ordinary choreography of a family meal, when Tisha said something about the wedding venue. We'd chosen a small, renovated barn outside the city, intimate, exactly us, and she said it with a smile. "It's very rustic." The pause before rustic was half a second long, that was all it took. My mother set down her fork. "Martha," she said in the tone she used when she was about to say something she had decided in advance to say, "I want you to really think about what you're building here." The table went quiet. "What do you mean?" I asked. I knew what she meant. She looked at Daniel, not unkindly, which was almost worse. "She mean that you have worked very hard, you have built something real, and I want to make sure that 10 years from now you're not carrying someone who couldn't carry himself." Daniel went very still, the way he goes still when he is choosing his words. "Daniel," my father started. "I'm her mother, Raymond." "Mom." My voice was steady. I remember being surprised by how steady it was. "Daniel has a career, a home, and he treats me with more respect than anyone in this room, so I'd appreciate—" "I'm not saying he's a bad person." She looked at Daniel again. "I'm sure you're a fine young man. I'm saying my daughter deserves someone who is going somewhere. I'm saying I've watched her work herself to the bone while this is what she's choosing, and I don't understand it." "This," she said, "this, not him. This." Tisha looked at her plate. Marcus looked at the wall. My father looked at the floor. Daniel put his napkin on the table, folded it, precisely the way he does everything, and said quietly, "Thank you for dinner." He stood, looked at me, and waited. That was it. No scene, no volume. He simply stood and waited for me. I looked at my mother. Her expression was composed, certain, the expression of someone who believes completely that they are the most reasonable person in the room. "You won't be at my wedding then," I said. It wasn't a question. "Martha." No. Something had clarified in me. Something that had been blurry for years had gone suddenly, irreversibly sharp. "If that is what you think of him, then you don't belong there, and I won't keep explaining myself to you." I stood. We left. I sat in the passenger seat of Daniel's car for 3 full minutes without speaking. He didn't fill the silence. That was one of the first times I fully understood why I was marrying him. He sat with me in it, steady, not trying to resolve it or minimize it, just present. Then he said, "You okay?" I thought about it honestly. "Not yet," I said, "but I will be." We drove home. 3 weeks later, we got married in that rustic barn with 40 people who loved us, and my parents' seats were empty, and I cried during my vows in the good way, and Daniel cried too, and the ferns I had arranged myself lined every table, and it was, without qualification, one of the best days of my life. My parents told anyone who would listen that they hadn't been invited. I'm going to pause here for a second. If this story is resonating with you, if you've ever felt the pain of being misunderstood by the people who are supposed to love you most, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It really lets me know that sharing these hard stories is worth it. Here is what nobody tells you about going no contact with a parent. They tell you it's brave, they tell you it's necessary, they tell you, if they have done it themselves, that there is a peace waiting on the other side that you cannot currently imagine. What they don't always tell you is what happens in the middle. The middle is long. The middle is where you find out what you're actually made of. The first thing that happened after the wedding was the campaign. I know that sounds dramatic, but I don't have a gentler word for it. My mother, this I pieced together over weeks through the relatives who still spoke to me and through the careful, pained phone calls from a few cousins who didn't know what to do with what they were hearing, began telling a story. The story was that I had gone off the rails, that I was isolating myself, that Daniel had changed me, pulled me away from my family, and that the girl they knew was somewhere in there, hostage to a man who controlled her. She used the word unstable more than once, to more than one person. Let me tell you what I was actually doing during this period. I was waking up at 5:30 in the morning and writing one sentence in a leather journal before I opened the shop. I was building my business, which had grown 30% in the previous year. I was married to a man who, on our second morning as husband and wife, made me coffee and put it on the nightstand, and then went back to the kitchen so I could wake up slowly without having to perform for anyone. I was tending my ferns and my dahlias and my eucalyptus, and I was, for the first time in a long time, genuinely fine. But the campaign had a geographic radius and a social reach I hadn't anticipated. My mother was in a church, she was in a neighborhood, she was in a family with arms that stretched into Georgia and South Carolina and a group chat that I had been removed from sometime in November. I found that out from my cousin Denise, who texted me privately and said, "I want you to know I don't believe what they're saying. I just thought you should know it's being said." That one hurt, not because I was surprised, because it confirmed the thing I had refused to fully believe, that she was working, that this was not just talk but a project, the management of a narrative. Tisha went silent. She didn't call, didn't text. A year of full sister silence. I kept expecting something, an olive branch, a private moment of acknowledgement, something that said, "I saw what happened, and I'm sorry." It didn't come. What came instead, through the filtered information of family channels, was the knowledge that Tisha had become my mother's primary audience and defender, the daughter who stayed, the one who proved that the family was fine and I was the anomaly. My father called once about 4 months in. He said, "I wish things were different, Martha." Just that. I waited for more. More didn't come. I said, "Me too, Dad." And then I sat with the profound sadness of a man who wished things were different and would do nothing to make them so. The grief was real. I need to say that clearly because I think people expect the no-contact decision to be a relief, and it is, eventually, but first, it is a grief. A complicated, ambiguous grief for people who are still alive, for relationships that never became what you needed them to be, for the version of your mother that used to bring flowers to a small girl's Christmas pageant and hold her face in both hands. That woman existed. I didn't invent her. Mourning her while simultaneously protecting yourself from who she became is one of the stranger emotional experiences available to a human being. I had 2 particular dark months, January and February of the first year. The holidays had been navigated, Daniel's family and Savannah, warm and loud and uncomplicated in the way his family somehow managed to be. But January came with its gray mornings and its quiet, and something in me settled into a heaviness I didn't have a name for. I went to work, I came home, I planted things. I went to a therapist named Dr. Anita Wade, who had an office off Peachtree Street, and a direct, unhurried quality I respected immediately. She asked me in our 3rd session what I missed most. I thought she meant my mother or my family. I said, "Sunday mornings." She waited. We used to drink tea and talk before anyone else was awake. I was the only one she saved that time for. I paused. I think I spent 20 years trying to get back into that kitchen. Dr. Wade wrote something down. Then she looked at me and said, "And who were you when you were in that kitchen?" I didn't answer right away because the answer, when it arrived, was uncomfortable. I was useful, I was quiet, I was the one who didn't need anything. I was exactly what she needed me to be. Small victories existed in those months, and I collected them the way you collect dry wood in winter, carefully, gratefully. Denise came to visit and spent a weekend sleeping in our guest room, and we stayed up until 2 a.m, and she said at some point, "You seem more yourself than I've seen you in years." A vendor I worked with wrote me an unprompted email saying that Bloom & Steady had become her favorite account to service because of the care I put into everything. Daniel and I got a dog, a scruffy mixed terrier we named Juniper, and Juniper had the precise effect on our household that dogs tend to have, which is to make the ordinary feel ceremonial. And I kept writing my one sentence every morning, just one. The practice had started as something to ground me, and it became something else, a record without intending to be, of a life that was genuinely growing.
The mistake people make about healing is thinking it's a destination. It's not. It's a practice. It's something you do daily, imperfectly, without guarantee of results, and then do again the next day. Dr. Wade told me something in maybe our 5th session that I've thought about regularly since. You don't heal from someone, you heal toward yourself. The distinction sounds small. It isn't. For the first year after going no contact, I was still healing from. I was still measuring my progress in terms of them, how much I thought about what my mother said, how often I rehearsed arguments in the shower, how much mental real estate the Collins family drama still occupied. I was free from the active harm, but I was still oriented toward it, still defining myself in relation to it, still letting their narrative about me set the terms even when I was arguing against it. The shift happened incrementally, not in one moment, but if I had to choose a marker, I'd point to a Saturday in late spring of the 2nd year. I had taken on a large wedding, a client who wanted elaborate garden installations throughout a venue in Buckhead, the biggest contract Bloom & Steady had landed. I spent 3 weeks designing it, sourcing the flowers, coordinating with my assistant. The day of the installation, I worked for 11 hours. I arranged anemones and garden roses and trailing jasmine along 40 feet of ceremony aisle. I stood back at the end of it and felt something so clean and uncomplicated that it took me a moment to name it. Pride. Just pure, uncluttered pride. Not relief that someone would approve, not anticipation of validation, just my own assessment of my own work, landing without an intermediary. I drove home and sat in the driveway for a minute before going inside, and I thought, there it is. That's what I'd been growing toward, not the absence of them, the presence of myself. Dr. Wade and I had spent considerable time on a concept she called inherited shame, the particular burden of being told repeatedly and by people in authority over you that your judgment is faulty. My mother's deployment of the word unstable had been precision targeted. It hit the exact frequency of a fear I'd carried since adolescence, the fear that my perception of things was somehow off, that others saw the situation more clearly than I did, that when my experience diverged from the family's official version, the family's version was probably correct. Years of that will hollow out your confidence in your own senses. You stop trusting what you see. You stop trusting what you feel. You rationalize and rationalize until rationalizing feels like wisdom. Therapy helped me trace the wiring, but something else helped me rebuild it. The journal. I had been writing one sentence every morning for 2 years by the time I realized what I had. Not a diary, not a record of events, but a continuous testimony of my own perception, dated and consistent, uncontaminated by anyone else's interpretation. I went back through them sometimes, pulled a journal from the windowsill and read the sentences in order. And what I found was not the portrait of an unstable woman. What I found was someone paying quiet, faithful attention to her own life. Someone who noticed beauty and difficulty in equal measure.
Someone who loved her husband and her plants and her work and her dog with a steadiness that had apparently been there all along, even when I couldn't see it. April 3rd. The white ranunculus came in today, and I stood over the bucket for 10 minutes. July 17th. Daniel fixed the gate without being asked, and I fell a little more in love. November 2nd. Hard day. Thought about calling Mom. Didn't. Watered everything instead. The sentences were small. They were also, in the aggregate, evidence. Evidence against a verdict that had been handed down about me without my participation, and that I had come dangerously close to accepting. I also, somewhere in the middle of the second year, stopped explaining myself. This was harder than it sounds. The impulse to explain, to provide context, to offer the full picture, to respond to my mother's narrative with the correct narrative, was so deeply trained in me that abandoning it felt like a physical release. I would catch myself composing responses to things she hadn't said to me directly, arguments for a court that wasn't in session. Slowly, I let those arguments go, not because I was wrong, but because I stopped needing to be publicly right. Healing, I learned, doesn't require an audience. There was one conversation late in the second year that I've returned to often. Denise called and mentioned in the context of a longer conversation that my mother had started telling people that she hoped I'd come around eventually, that she'd forgiven me for the distance and was leaving the door open. I sat with that for a moment. The reframing was so complete it was almost elegant. I had become, in this version, the one who had withdrawn, the one being forgiven, the prodigal who would eventually return. "How do you feel about that?" Denise asked. I thought about it. I said, "I feel like it's not my story, and that used to scare me. Now it just doesn't." The business grew. I took on an assistant, a 23-year-old named Priya, who turned out to be both talented and relentlessly cheerful in a way that balanced my quieter energy perfectly. Daniel was promoted to senior project manager and came home that evening with a bottle of sparkling wine and the specific look of someone who is more excited to tell you than to celebrate himself. We adopted a second dog. I started a small window box herb garden that had no commercial purpose whatsoever. I found, without planning it, that my daily one-sentence journal entries had started to shift. Less witness-bearing, more just noticing. Less, "I survived today," and more, "the basil is finally thriving." I was in the third year of our silence. I had stopped counting the days. I had stopped rehearsing. I was tending my garden, literally and otherwise, and the ground was good. Then, one Tuesday morning in October, the mail came. I have thought a lot about the right word for what I felt reading that letter. Vindication isn't quite it. That implies I needed something confirmed that I wasn't already sure of. Relief isn't it either. The closest I've come is completion, like the last piece of a sentence clicking into place, like the moral logic of the situation, which had always been clear to me, and only to me, finally becoming visible to everyone who needed to see it. Here is what the letter said, plainly. My maternal grandmother, my mother's mother, Nana Rose, who had passed away 4 years earlier, had left a modest estate that included a house in South Carolina and a savings account. My grandmother apparently had put both my name and my mother's name on the account's original paperwork years ago in what her attorney explained was a goodwill gesture toward the eldest grandchild. Nobody had mentioned this to me. My mother, apparently, had not considered it worth mentioning until she needed those funds released and discovered that without my signature on a specific disbursement document, nothing could move. The woman who had spent 3 years managing my reputation, who had called me unstable and uninvited herself from my wedding and turned half the family against my husband, needed my permission. Attorney Harold Vance was professional and neutral. The letter was entirely civil, It was simply, in 4 short paragraphs, a complete and unambiguous reversal of every power dynamic my mother had spent years constructing. And I don't think she understood that when she sent it. I think she sent it as a formality, maybe expecting a delay, maybe expecting me to simply sign and return without comment. I don't think she expected me to find it funny. I don't think she considered what it would mean for me to hold that letter in my garden apron with soil under my fingernails and feel for the first time in 3 years entirely, structurally unhurried. I called Attorney Vance 2 days later. I was polite. I asked several reasonable questions. I took the full time the law allows to review the document. I consulted my own attorney, a woman named Grace, who had been my business lawyer for 2 years, and who read the letter with raised eyebrows and said, "Well." I signed it. I want to be clear about that. I signed it because Nana Rose had meant those funds for the family, and withholding them would have been petty in a way that wasn't in me. This was never about punishment. It was never about evening a score with the scoreboard visible. That was never the kind of justice I was after. What I was after, what I had been quietly, patiently building for 3 years, was a life that didn't require their approval to stand up, a self that didn't collapse when they pushed, a business, a marriage, a daily practice of paying attention, a shelf of journals that proved in my own handwriting that I had been paying attention all along. That was the revenge, if you want to call it that. Not the letter, not the signature. The fact that when the letter arrived, I was already okay. The fact that their need found me whole. My mother and I have not spoken since. The signature was returned, the matter was resolved, and Attorney Vance sent a brief confirmation, and that was the end of it. Perhaps someday the shape of things will change. I don't carry hope for it the way I used to. That particular hope had quietly metabolized into something more neutral, something I can look at without flinching. If she were ever to extend something genuine, not forgiveness for a wrong I didn't commit, but real accountability, real reckoning, I would receive it carefully and honestly and with whatever is left of the girl who used to sit at the breakfast bar on Sunday mornings and believe she was fully known. But I don't need it, that's the thing. The girl who needed it so badly she explained herself for 20 years has grown into something steadier, something that can stand in a garden in October, laugh at 4 paragraphs of legal stationery, slide the letter across a counter to her husband and watch him start laughing too. I used to believe silence was safety. Now I know it was strategy. I used to believe their story about me. Now I tell my own. Every morning, 1 true sentence at a time. This was another story from Revenge Room, where we turn pain into purpose and betrayal into balance. If this story moved you, please subscribe and join us for the next transformation. And before you go, I want to ask you something. What's one thing you learned about yourself after a betrayal? Share it below. You might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. And remember, you're not alone in this, and you are enough. Until next time.